Ladies and gentlemen, comrades and friends of the OR Tambo School of Leadership, welcome to yet another episode of Tintswalo's Perspective. Today we are marking our 9th episode on this platform that is meant for young people to echo their sentiments and views and perspectives about the future of this country, to tell us about the work that they are engaged in on a day-to-day basis to ensure the transformation of our society for the better. This is a platform where we believe young people of this country and beyond are playing a very fundamental role in the transformation agenda of this country, and they actually do have their own views about how things should be moving forward. Today we are having yet again another meaningful conversation that is particularly important, especially considering that we are still in Youth Month. And today we'll be discussing the question around the importance of youth representation and participation in decision making. There has been calls over time that young people have to be given their seat at the table, that young people are ready to actually start cultivating the kind of future that they foresee, not only for themselves, but for future generations as well. One good friend of mine who passed on in 2016 by the name of Takalo Mudima used to say that we are the ones that we are waiting for, meaning that we are ready, we are capable, we are developing ourselves, and we're playing our part and ready to take this country forward. Today, joining me is a comrade that needs no introduction. This is Cde Fasiha Hassan, one of the most astute youth politicians I've had the privilege to work with closely and to see develop into the formidable force of change that she is. So I'm going to bring her on screen so that she can properly introduce herself as per the tradition of Tintswalo's Perspective, and then we'll get on with the conversation. Cde Fasiha, thank you very much for joining us tonight. I've been really chasing you down. I think for the last 4 weeks, I've been relentlessly, bothering you to form part of the people that come here, the young people that are contributing to this platform. So thank you so much for eventually availing time and being part of us. Kindly introduce yourself to our viewers, and in your introduction, tell us a little bit about your activism journey and what you are currently involved in.
Yeah, no, thanks. I know Kifense has really been chasing me for this particular podcast. I think it was actually after swearing in, I gave a public commitment that I would be here. So I'm happy, very happy to finally be on the show. Yeah, I think you covered a little bit about it, and actually very humbled by a lot of the things you've said. Comrade Kifense was SRC president actually the year after I was SG. So it was actually then that we really sort of cut our teeth both politically, but also as friends. So I think that's also boding well for today's conversation. So yeah, I was in the Wits SRC. We went on to lead what we now know as Fees Must Fall. But I've also been very involved in the PYA. I was the provincial treasurer of SASCO, deputy president of SAUS, the national SRC body. But ultimately, I've now just been sworn in from the ANC side into Parliament. I'm one of the younger members in Parliament, not the youngest anymore, but I think we're going to talk about that. I think it's a victory that I'm not the youngest anymore. I was in the Gauteng legislature. I was elected at 25, and now I'm 30. So we're sort of continuing, moving from province to national. And in the Gauteng legislature, I also chaired the portfolio committees of economic development and then later COGTA as well, cooperative governance.
Thank you so much, Comrade Fasiha. And once again, congratulations on your swearing in as a member of parliament. Some of us have no doubt that you will do your best to, represent our people well and shake up things, because part of the reason why we are advocating for young people to occupy these spaces is for them to shake up things, we want things to move with some speed and some sense of,
Definitely.
because when you look at the socio-economic conditions and realities that are faced by our people, they signal a very serious, need for us to move with agency in terms of resolving some of those challenges that we face. Otherwise, we're just, fertilizing a ground for political and social instability in the near future. So we hope that you guys will play that role, and maybe getting into it. Why is it so important that young people must, be represented and actively participate on these tables that make decisions about, the country, important organizations, and our future, really? Why is it important that young people should sit on those tables?
Look, it's fundamental. In South Africa, we think we're unique, but so often in the global context, but particularly in the African context, most of our countries have a majority young people under the age of 35. But we have a particularly unique experience as South African young people because the majority of us have not lived under apartheid, born post apartheid, or born into a fundamentally different South Africa. And one of the reasons why it becomes so important that young people are at the decision making table is because we bring a completely fresh and new perspective to whatever issue it is that we were covering at the moment. And so often there's this delinking, I think, between those different generations. There's this idea that those who served in the struggle, of course, have a fundamental role to play, no doubt, experiential, etc. But there's nobody who's saying, well, what are we doing in terms of the fourth industrial revolution? What are we doing with the proliferation of social media and AI, for example, in terms of how we look at human rights issues, in terms of how we look at service delivery issues? But most importantly, who is speaking for the millions of South Africans who are in the majority, who are young people, and who actually fundamentally have not had a strong voice at the decision making table? And I think this is another important point. It's not just about having young people there, because so often we think that, hey, if we get so many young ministers or so many young people in a position, or even women for that matter, we will have solved the oppression issue. It's going to take a lot more than that. And it's also about breaking youth tokenism. One of the things that I think was very difficult in the previous administration or the previous term in the legislature was the only person, I was literally the only person who was under the age of 35. And so, apart from there being this tokenistic kind of politics, what can you really do as one person? And I think that's what's fundamentally different about the seventh term. There are so many more young people. Of course, the ANC has put forward incredible young people, but other political parties have done the same. And I think we're in a very unique situation in which we as young people in South Africa across political parties can now start to organize. Does that mean having a youth caucus in parliament? Does that mean having a youth element in cabinet? Does that mean that when the elders make a decision, we say, actually, hold on, what's that going to do to young people? We agree, we disagree. Let's look at the green economy. So it's about having a strong say. It's being able to influence fundamentally the decision making process, not just having a seat at the table. Because we've learned see, it doesn't mean anything, actually, if we're being honest, if you can't actually influence or make the decision yourself.
No, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Comrade Fassi. And I think you raise a number of important issues that I would like to poke a bit further. This question of tokenism that you speak about, how do we begin to challenge that, taking into consideration the need to start consolidating our organization? Because more often than not, even in this platform, it has been expressed that it's not that young people are not organized, but it seems like we're organizing in silos. How do we begin to move towards building a strong power base that will consolidate, this youth oomph, into a meaningful force of change in society?
I actually think you're quite right. We tend to work in very different streams. We may be working towards the same goal, but our energies aren't necessarily pulled together. And I think that's been one of the challenges, even when we're looking at solving youth unemployment. So we know we need a multi pronged approach. But if you think of it very practically, if you have a pin or a knife that you're trying to put through a piece of cloth, if you're going to go all 50 different places, it's very hard to get the pin through. But if all of us put all of our energies into the same point in the same space, you're going to get that pin or that knife through quite easily. It means you're going to have an impact. And one of the things that we haven't done, I think, as young people, is actually say that we're going to support each other over the elders. One thing that I've also learned is, and I say it with all due respect, that elder generation, they support each other, hey? They back each other. And they'll say, hey, we want Comrade Kifense, we want Comrade X, Comrade Y, whatever, whatever. And they, as solid generational group, find ways to have expression. Now, what we haven't done well enough, Kifense, I think, is that we often see each other as enemies, as young people. So we don't want Mang Mang to ascend because it's going to be a factional problem for me, my forces, this, you know. And what ends up happening is we're victims of our own sort of doing. And it helps old people. Of course, if we are busy fighting amongst each other as young people for the scraps at the end of the table, who's eating the whole meal? And they're sitting there laughing at us. Look at these ones. They think they're going to lead. They're not going to lead until we actually start to not necessarily organize. I think we are organizing, but until we get to a point of saying, even if it's not me, but if there's a young person there, that is a success, number one, for the movement, and number two, for our generation. And if we're being honest, Comrade Kifense, I don't know if all of us have that same view. And I think that's something that we need to build and coalesce, because so often it's about my forces and my people, instead of saying, what are we doing as a generation? What are we doing for the masses of young people? And let me also say this. I think when we change our approach, I think ordinary young people on the ground are going to start identifying, both with the Youth League and the PYA, the Progressive Youth Alliance, so much more, because it doesn't look like a selfish act. We're not here to empower ourselves. We're here to empower millions of young people. And when we change the lens, I think a lot more young people are going to get on board in terms of this long-term project. And that's why I know I'm getting ahead, but when we talk about the national dialogue, that's one of the things that I think we need to be looking at going forward. But I don't want to skip ahead. I'll keep to it as you are my chairperson in this space.
No, thank you very much. It's okay. It's okay. It's chilled. There is no censoring here. There are no strict rules of engagement. We are young people, But I think you touched on something there that has been worrying me a lot, because we tend to have this unfounded and baseless jealousy towards each other, you know. I often say to comrades, particularly in the space that I find myself now at the school, the Watambo School of Leadership, I say, look, for me, a victory of any young person is a representation of our collective victory. And I'm willing to support each and every young person, despite the fact that we may have different views on a number of issues or whatever, differences that we may have. But I understand that if this young person is able to make it where they are, they create space for other young people, because the people in the space themselves begin to ask the questions like, if we could achieve so much with just this young person being here alone, how about if we were to have 2 and 3 more young people, right? And it's very important that we support each other. But it's also important, and I'd like you to comment on this, to develop ourselves enough such that when we're given those opportunities, we actually perform to the best of our abilities, with this sense of responsibility that our performance is what should open doors for other young people. So how do we effectively do that, right? Why is it so important that we develop ourselves and we are prepared for these spaces that we want to occupy, such that when it's a Kifens or whoever, we would not have any fear that this person would actually do what is expected of them.
Few points. The first is that as a young person or as young people, we are always criticized of not having enough experience. And we're not going to wake up and just have 20 years of experience. So how do you manage that, or how do you dilute that sort of argument. The first way is by having qualifications. It's about investing not only in your formal education, but also in informal. So it goes both ways. We want people to go out and get qualifications. I think we all understand not everyone could afford it, but there's different ways in which you can do it. And I think we've seen so many young comrades who are going through the ranks now, even in different governmental departments, even in different organizations linked to the ANC, for example. The Oratampo School is one of those, showing your proving your worth, showing your mettle, so to speak. And I think so many people, we overlook this. Hard work, there's no shortcut to hard work. And I've also had to learn that in the movement. You really just have to put in the hours. You have to be there first, leave last. You have to volunteer to do the work. It's exhausting. You have to do overnighters for different documents that people may need. You need to really, really push. And that's the part that we don't talk about, Comrade Kifense. We talk about XYZs being deployed and we talk about the different caucuses, but we don't talk about what actually proves us separate to that generation. And that, like I said, is qualifications, working hard, but it's also about showing a different kind of thinking. And this is something that perhaps in the ANC we haven't encouraged enough. So because I think we want to have, and this is the correct approach, you want to have a more socialist approach, a more collectivist approach, but that doesn't take away from creative thinking or innovation. We need to be ahead of them. So what used to happen, for example, in portfolio committees in legislature, you may not know as much as the person sitting next to you who's been there on the NCOP or, in whichever form for many, many more years than you. But you can go out and do the research. You can go see what they're doing in Mexico. You can read up on this issue and that issue, bring it to the portfolio committee and show that you bring a fundamentally different view, but also a different view that is, of course, mass-based, right? Is socialist in its approach, is of course pro-poor, all of the different ideas, non-sexist, non-racial, all of those character building issues of our party or of your political movement. You show it in different ways. And I think so often you think that you need to say those words, or you need to be in a commission, or you need to be in a very fundamentally ANC space to say, no, we need to be the ones as young people who are writing op-eds. This conversation that we're having around youth token, let's write about it. Let's get it published wherever we want to. But the point being is we need to also be thought leaders. We need to be leading the conversation in different places. And I also wonder in the current coalition spaces, what have we done in terms of research? What are other countries doing? What are the best types of dispute resolution mechanisms? How can we, and this is the big one, we as young people leverage off this GNU in the best possible way, and not just to get young ministers or deputy ministers or whatever. It's about a long-term investment, because if this is the new normal, how do we as young people position ourselves with the kind of agility of skill sets that actually say, look, as young people coming up, we know how to coalesce with other political parties. We know how to pass legislation without being a majority. There's skills here that we can build off that the other elders don't have. And that's why I actually think of this particular moment actually as a huge opportunity for us as young people. And I think the moment you start to look differently at these moments, you're also able to garner a different outcome, not necessarily for everyone, but for us as well as young people.
No, definitely, I agree. And in fact, this is what this platform is all about. This is primarily the reason why we created Tintswalo's perspective, to actually, say young people have ideas, young people are thought leaders, and young people must have those ideas and be those thought leaders and express them. And when you're speaking about the GNU moment, coalition moment, we've already had two previous episodes, getting the reaction of young people. Personally, I have taken it upon myself to enter into the battle of ideas. In fact, tomorrow there's one grouping called the National Political Dialogue that has invited us to engage our input on the GNU and its impact for the organization. So I fully agree with you that this is our moment, right? And hence I was so disappointed, and I'm still disappointed, and I've expressed this here, I think, in the two previous episodes. I feel like the PYA as a whole, the Progressive Youth Alliance, is not, rising to the occasion. It's not, really realizing the seriousness of the moment and the fact that this is a moment where we are all looking at young people in particular to take us out of this moment, and maybe you can comment on that a bit, But in your comment, I want you to tell us how important is political consciousness in preparation for, one sitting at the table, right? Such that, you find yourself in a space, you are sitting with different parties, and there is a fierce contestation of ideas where you may be easily swayed into, adopting ideas that are not really ideologically based on what we believe in, that are uncharacteristic. They may sound good, but in their form and content, they are uncharacteristic to what the ANC is all about. So, how important is political consciousness, understanding the ANC and its core principles when you go into such spaces?
The true test of this moment is actually in that, in which you've said, in terms of conscientization. It's a moment in which, if we don't know who we are and what we're trying to achieve, many of us have thought about and written about and thought around the National Democratic Revolution and the National Democratic State, but are we actually understanding what that means? Because so many people have now said that the GNU is taking us back in terms of our developmental politics, in terms of who we are. And if you look at the history actually of the ANC, and many people don't know this, especially those who are outside of the organization, the ANC has risen actually to these moments of very difficult change or very difficult moments in South Africa's history. If you see when the ANC was initially formed in 1912, just short of the 1913 Land Act, which fundamentally and violently dispossessed us all of land and all many other rights as well, of course, right? If you look at 1944, when the Youth League was formed, and that program of action that was developed, the organization was in crisis. So many young people said, well, actually, we disagree with how you've been managing your politics. If you look at Mogorogoro at that moment, if you look at all these different watershed moments, you see the ANC actually rise like a phoenix out of the ashes, out of this fundamental difficulty. And I think this is one such moment. For the first time in a long time, we saw a very level headed leadership saying, you may not necessarily have voted for us, but we accept the outcomes. And we are going to do so not because we are obviously happy with the outcome, but because there's such a fundamental issue at stake, which is the future of this country. And what I'm trying to show you here is, had we not have this political conscientization, it would have been very easy to say, we'll be petty. Go form a government without us. Let's see if you can do it without us. Even if at 40%, people think it's mathematically possible, but it's not. It's not possible to form a national government outside of the ANC. And if the ANC was petty, they could have said, we'll wipe our hands off the situation. You didn't vote for us, right? We'll leave it at that. But our political conscientization, our knowledge, our understanding, and what grounds us, both in the organization and what's made us activists, has taught us to put the South African people first. And that's why I say this moment is a true test of who we are as the ANC. And let me answer, or let me not answer, but let me deal with the first point that you made around the PYA. So many people know I'm one of the spokespersons of the ANC Youth League on a national level. And I'll be honest, I think it's been a difficult period. We've all had lots of opinions and lots of things that we want to say. And of course, because of the GNU negotiations, you have to be very careful in how you manage it. But behind closed doors, there has been incredibly robust discussion, incredibly robust debate. We may not all necessarily agree or disagree with certain points, but once a decision's been made, and we all know this, we rally behind that decision and we make sure that we work and we make sure that it works as a fundamental point. So I think there's a lot to be said about how it was dealt with. And I think it's a learning moment. I think that we, as both the Youth League, as SASCO, as COSAS, as the YCL, we need to learn from this moment and say, right, now that we are here, before we come to 2026, what's our positions on these? Let's draft different papers on what we think local government coalition looks like. What does Mochapalong putting forward young people mean in the context of a GNU, for example? We need to, before, it's like the floodgate. When the floodgate opens, oh my God, all of us want to talk. But before that, we need to be measured. We need to sit, we need to do research, and we need to think. And I think that's one of the things that perhaps right now we were overtaken by events. But I think it's a learning moment. And I think it's in a moment where we can go back to our constituency, back to young people and say, right, what we are doing now is fighting for that same concept of Mucha Balong to have young people at the decision making table. But we take your point, Comrade Gifense. I mean, at the time in which the decisions were being made, so many calls, all of us got. So many people, what's the Youth League view? What are you saying about this? What are you saying about that? And we released a number of statements, but perhaps next time we need to have some sort of a summit. Maybe we need to have some sort of a meeting. And, we need to coalesce what young people think, because like we said in the earlier part of this conversation, if we don't do it, the elder generation are going to make decisions for us, and we're never going to have a say at that. So I think I take that, and I think moving forward, it's something that we need to change.
No, thank you very much, Comrade Fasiha, for that. And I agree with you that, this is a moment of learning, and we should learn, and learn from each other, do not undermine the collective wisdom of all of us, even when we disagree on issues. And I think I like the issue that you touched on, that the ANC has gone through such seminal moments, and it's what defines it and sustain it and gives it the life that it has. And I think there's no person who explains this better for me than Jeremy Cronin, when he says, in every decade since its launch in 1912, the ANC has confronted challenges and sometimes serious external and internal crises. It is easy to lose sight of this, imagining that the history of the ANC and its movement is simply a triumphant march from one victory to the next. This is neither accurate nor empowering for activists dealing with the complexities of the present. And for me, that captures what you just said. To say, uh, often when we tell the history of the ANC and the role that it played in the liberation struggle, we tell it as if it's just one package of one victory to the next, whereas there have been serious moments that have posed serious existential threat to the very existence of the ANC. And it was through harnessing the energy of young people that we're able to, overcome those challenges and become a 112 years old liberation movement, the oldest liberation movement on the African continent. I'd like us to move a bit, Comrade Fasiha. You are part of young people that have been earmarked to go to parliament, and you come with an experience from being the youngest MPL, and you've already touched on some of your experience. What would be your advice for young people that are going into different legislatures, including the national legislature for the first time? What is it that they need to be cognizant of? What is it that they need to avoid? What are the do's and don'ts? So that, at least they can hear it from someone who has been in that space, although at a different level.
Look, I think it's easy to be a deer in headlights at the beginning. It's how I felt, and many of us felt in 2019, especially because you're so few, you don't know what to do, you don't really have a benchmark. And there are many people who are very helpful and wanting to give you advice, and I think we should take it. But the thing with the political realm is you also need a little bit of savvy to figure out which advice is good and which advice is, maybe a little bit more nefarious to set you up. So my first point is always to stay humble and to stay respectful. That's one thing that's really going to take you in your stead, because there's a very particular idea that they have of us as young people. And it's always good to, when people have a very negative view of you, it's always good to shock them. But beyond that, have a different sort of view for South African people who actually want to see, by the way, younger MPs, younger MPLs. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is that you also need to work extremely hard. You don't have the luxury or the quality of saying, hey guys, I know what I'm talking about. You may have the qualifications, yes, but the person sitting next to you on your left and right across political parties, they'll tell you they've been here for 30 years. What do you know about oversight? What do you know about the PFMA, the Public Finance Management Act. And so that's the first thing that you need to do. And I remember at the very beginning, whatever portfolio committee you have, read the documents. Like, this sounds so basic and arbitrary, but please read the documents. And at the beginning, it's hard. I mean, I used to stay up till 4 a.m. right at the beginning for weeks, every other day, because there's fewer people. Also, what happened in Gauteng, you're not going to sit with one committee. You're going to sit with many. So you sit till 3, 4 a.m. every day trying to go through the documents. And it's not always going to be like that. It's difficult at the beginning. But if you push through and trudge through, within a few months, you'll know and understand the different issues in each department, which means you don't have to stay up till 4 a.m. every day reading the documents, because you'll read those documents faster. You'll know where to look. The other thing that you need to learn very quickly is how governmental departments mask issues. If you see lots of information, go do some research there. But if you also see a one-liner on an issue, go look at that. Because what tends to happen is they crouch things, sometimes in a lot of information, sometimes in very little. And that's why it takes time and acumen to really learn what those issues are, but also listen. This is something that I also give advice to myself. Sometimes we as young people think that we do know better, and we may, indefinitely, in terms of technology and certain other experiences. But there's huge power in listening. And I don't just mean this in terms of listening to the department or the minister. I mean listening also to opposition. One of the things that I learned to do is I make lots of notes. I always have a notebook. I do have my iPad and all of that, but the point is the notebook, because if you are noting what the opposition is saying in each committee meeting, by the time you get to the debate, and actually a DA member said this to me recently, he said, well, how do you know what we're going to say before we even debate? And the reason why I knew where they were going to hit us is because I made extensive notes for months on the different points there. And it's just every day, DA is saying this, IFP is saying this, EFF is saying this. So that when you go to the debate, whether you are the first speaker or the last or the in-between, you have prepared a speech that is already dealing with their issues. And what that shows, number one, is your capacity, your humility, your ability to learn. But also you impress even the ANC comrades who are like, oh, we didn't know you could do that. We didn't know you understood those issues in that way. So always be one step ahead of the game. And let me also say this, Comrade Kifense, because I don't know if we do enough positive work on this. For a lot of people who are coming into parliaments and legislatures now, many are really young. I know there's some 20-year-olds, etc. And you're going to earn a certain amount of money. Firstly, it's a lot less than you think it is. We all pay tax, there's many deductions, but be financially savvy. You don't need to drive the most expensive car or wear the most expensive clothing. Invest in your future. You'll have a pension fund, but open up other investment opportunities and investment funds. You don't have to live a high life so young. And the other thing that people don't understand about a political career is that it's not always guaranteed. So you must invest in other parts of yourself. And this is also something I'm trying to work on. I had registered for my master's in 2019 and I deregistered because I found it too hectic. I was worried about my marks, but I regret it now because I should have just done it and I should have just finished it. So also while you're doing that, especially once you found your feet after the first year, register to study. There's so many opportunities where they pay for your funding. It's not just about self-development. It's also about you being a better public representative. And sorry, the last point, Kifense, that I really want to emphasize. Constituency and community work is as important, if not more important, than your portfolio committee work. So the way parliaments and legislatures are structured, because it's so structured on committee meetings, and then you have 1 or 2 days for constituency work, but you're sort of left to your own devices, i.e. you can decide what committee work you want to, community work you want to do, based, of course, on an ANC manifesto. Don't let that make you think that it's less important or that it's laissez-faire. If you do your community and constituency work really well, that community will fight for you to come back in 5 years' time. And that's something that I experienced. I was recently in Lodium, which is actually where I'm deployed to in Tshwane, in Gauteng. And there was somebody who's been very critical of the ANC and of me and of the whole space. And one of the last meetings we had during elections, this guy got up and he said, actually, we've worked really hard and we want Fasiha and the ANC to come back. And this is not someone who supports the ANC, This is somebody who, because of the community work that was done, actually had a belief or a renewed mandate, both in the party, but also in the system. And that for me is somewhat more important. And it's easy to be like, on Monday, I'll just chill. Monday, I'll do this, I'll do that, because those are your constituency days. Take it seriously, because that same committee can also mean your political future, but also because people don't know the kind of help that's out there, and we have that ability to change their lives. And is that not the reason why we all became activists in the first place?
No, thank you so much, Comrade Fasia. If I was one of those young people, I would actually, if not watch this whole thing, that part that we just touched on, I would actually cut it out and it becomes my daily bread, because I think you touch on very practical, important things that one needs to be conscious of. And maybe before I bring in the viewers here to also pose their questions, some of which have already started coming in with some comments, I would like to, um, ask you to add one more thing. What kind of whispers should you keep around you? What kind of people do you consider as advisors, that should advise you on the kind of work that you should do? Because more often than not, we go astray, not because we are incapable or because we are disingenuous, but because of the voices that whisper into our ears. And lastly, how important is it to keep in touch with the structures of the ANC? In as much as you spoke about constituency work, how how important is it to ensure that as you do this work, you are not, actively involved in the structures of the ANC and the responsibilities that you might have on that front?
Let me start with that. Fundamentally important. You cannot be far from an ANC structure. And this is something that sometimes makes it difficult because so many people sort of think that, hey, it must be quite nice to be an MP or an MPL, but you have extreme workloads because at the times in which everyone else is going to see their family or their friends, you've got a political program, you've got to do ANC work. Over weekends, you've got to do your community and constituency work. The best thing also, if you have the time and the ability, is also to combine those things. So when you do a community outreach process, make sure you're doing it with your local branch. They don't have to be the recipients. In fact, they shouldn't be, right? But they are the guys who are helping you. They are the people who are helping you identify the stakeholders, who are helping you get the work done. It comes with different challenges, of course, but you can never be far from an ANC structure. Otherwise, two things: you'll be accused of being distant, but also you are not then plugged into the renewal of the African National Congress. Because one of the ways we need to all do this, right? One of the ways we need to renew is all of us going back into our branches, all of us going back into our zones and in our regions and seeing how we can support. And there's so many ways that we can do that, right? Even if you just look at your own community, what are those different issues? Call up the branch, let's do a program together. And it's interesting and nice when you have a parliamentary constituency office that's active because they'll eventually come to you. They'll be like, there's these illegal electricity connections, let's do this about that. We have an issue of undocumented foreign nationals, for example, in my home ward. We were doing some work around that. So there's many different points. But let me also say, if you don't have grounding in an ANC structure, it's easy to float away. And that can be really, really dangerous for two reasons. The first is, remember, the seat does not belong to you. It belongs to the African National Congress. And the second is, you are one of many in a very long line of people who have contributed not for ourselves, but for the future of the country. And you must think about it as paving the way. You know, when you put down a stone, it means the next person doesn't have to step on a thorn, putting down those stones as you go along. So fundamentally important. And there's ways to do it as well. Maybe we need to have another whole conversation about how we remain closer to ANC structures. And that's not only contesting, it's also just about being physically present with comrades in those spaces. And then on the advisors question, I don't know exactly if my answer will be the right one, but I think you need a variety. The same person you're consulting for ANC work doesn't necessarily have to be the person you're consulting for governance stuff. In fact, unless they have those skill sets, it probably shouldn't be the same person. So when you want to organize a youth program, you need to have the right people around you. And you also begin to see as you go along people who are there for the high life, so to speak, and those who are there for the actual hard work. And you'll see that those people who arrive first leave last, the person who's willing to pick up the chairs, things like that. You start to actually see the character of people who want to see a better future both for the country and for the ANC. And those are people to keep close. But it takes time. And I think all of us will, at some point in our life, make a mistake about who we think the right advisors are. So I think that's important. And then the last thing is also always just reference, all of us are different. Some people are religious, some people have a different type of true north, some people meditate. Everyone has their family, the church. It doesn't really matter what that thing is for you, but always cross-reference it. So I'm a Muslim, I'm a practicing Muslim, and whenever there's something dodgy, I'm like, oh, I get a dodgy feeling, and I sort of go out and reason. What do my principles tell me? What do my Islamic principles tell me? What is that value system? And when two or three of those points are not met, I'm like, no, something's wrong here. So even in the advice that you get, if you're uncomfortable, go and seek more advice. Go and think about it. Because the thing with political space and political office is the advice you get can often be littered with people's personal interests. There will always be that. But it's about the ability to sift through to what's important, because you'll always get advice from left, right, and center. And it's about figuring out what works the best and what works here and there. And the last point is also to establish yourself as an independent thinker, both in the ANC and in the governance space. So that doesn't mean you are violating an ANC manifesto position. No. But you are able to stand on your own 2 feet and say, I agree with this, I disagree with that. And I actually have found that comrades are more respectful and take it more seriously if you disagree with a good reason than if you say nothing at all. And that's also been a lesson that I've had to learn as well.
No, thank you so much, Fasiha. I see a lot of comments. There's just one question that came through. So I'll ask my viewers to post their questions, and then we'll share them here. And while they do that, so that they can come at least in streams of three, because I know that you're limited on time. You mentioned the national dialogue, and I can't conclude this conversation without talking about that. To say, in this announcement of the need to have a government of national unity, one of the key things that have been stressed and are a precondition of anyone being a signatory to the statement of intent is this idea of a national dialogue, right? Now, how do we as young people organize ourselves in preparation of that national dialogue? What are the key issues that we want to see on the agenda? And what is it that we want this national dialogue to produce as an outcome, not only in our favor, but in the favor of the whole country, but making sure that whatever that comes out of there has been influenced by us?
First point, we need to, as young people, have our own dialogue prior, I think. And that's not going to be, in fact, I had this discussion with someone earlier today. I don't think it should be in the same format we've always done our events. You go, you have plenary, you break into commissions, come back, everything's pre-decided. I don't think that's going to work. I think we need to think about different formats, but we do need to get as many young people to the table as possible. And it doesn't mean that we all have to agree on everything, right? It needs that, that this idea of a minimum program. I think there's some value in it, because as long as there's a minimum program, we even did this during Fees Must Fall. We didn't agree on everything, but the minimum program was a free, quality, decolonized education. And nobody could disagree with that, right? Because if anyone said, oh, we don't want accessible education, I mean, it was an unpopular view. So we need to come up with what that minimum program is, and then take that minimum program to the national dialogue. Because I don't want us to sit in a situation where we as young people are relegated to the peripheries of the sideline. So that's why I'm saying this national dialogue cannot happen without us as young people. But in the same way, this youth dialogue I'm talking about also cannot replace the national dialogue, right? It's a precursor, so that when young people go, we'll say, actually, we met 2 weeks ago. There were 10,000 young people, whatever amount it was. I don't think it will be that big. It will probably be more representative. But these 10,000 young people said, here's a youth freedom charter. Here's our youth charter of what we think is important, right? This is what we think we need to do in terms of agro-processing. This is what we want to do to solve youth unemployment in the different streams. And ultimately, one of the things we also need to do and agree as young people is that we are going to streamline ourselves into mainstream issues. This idea is youth issues. Sure, but don't we all care about corruption and removing it? Don't we all care about the economy? Don't we all care about having good education systems? Yeah, so are these really youth issues? Or are they national issues that we as young people have taken an interest in? And the reason why I'm saying it differently in terms of semantics is because I want us to stop being relegated to the sidelines. Even somebody today was saying, yeah, young people, there's a portfolio committee in Parliament, women, youth, and disabilities. And there's an importance to having that kind of focus. But you can't put all of the young MPs in that committee. No. We want to be in justice. We want to be in energy. We have opinions on ESCOM and how it needs to be fixed. We have views on SAA and what needs to happen. And we need to, as young people, say, gone are the days where you're going to relegate us to the sidelines. We are going to be in every important issue having a different view, and presenting that and pushing that forward. And let me also say this, there are incredibly talented young people in this country. So there's not a thing of we don't know what to say, we can't draft the document. No. We have some of the brightest economists, brightest statisticians, brightest agricultural experts, for example. What we need to do is put us all in one room and say, what is the minimum program on each of these industries? Take it and go and fight for those things. Because this national dialogue, the way I understand it, is going to focus a lot on the economy. It's going to focus a lot on issues that are going to fundamentally affect us, our children, and our grandchildren. And we want to, as young people, say, we went to this historic dialogue, summit, conference, whatever you want to call it. These were the issues that we pushed. And then a year down the line, say, right, young MPs, what's going on here? Young minister, okay, now we support you. Let's go and fight the same battle of implementation in the other spaces, because that's fundamentally important. And the last point I also want to make is really around how we do succession planning. Let me say it like that, succession planning. One of the problems that we always face is, who has the capacity and the ability to do this job? And then everyone's scrambling, looking around. That ends now, and it must end with us. There must be a streamline of young people that are ready to take that position. And one of the reasons why I'm actually so happy and so proud that I'm not the youngest MP or MPL anymore is it's actually a victory of what I've just said to you, that we've brought so many young people into that space. If you're the only young person or the only woman or the only Black person at a table, that's not good enough. It's actually not. You need to fundamentally flip it on its head. And I think that's one of the things that the national dialogue needs to really come out with as well.
No, thank you so much, Comrade Fasiha. Let me add in the questions that have come through. You'll note them down and answer them all at once, because I think we are moving closer to 7 o'clock, unless if you'll be gracious enough to grant us some extra time. So the first one is from Vusi Zigalala, says, Fasiha, now a parliamentarian with a seat in parliament, what are the 5 key economic development policies that she will be promoting and upholding for young people? What are the emerging economic development and youth empowerment policies that she will be championing for grassroots in implementation? Should have worn my glasses. This text is very small, but it's fine. Then there is Mahlatsi, who says, are there any possible chances that the ANC Youth League can take over and lead government? Okay, that's a bold question. And then there is Tabani Mtombeni, who says, what is your take on challenges facing the youth, and what in order of priorities would you put first in the list of you addressing them? And then there is Mhlonipeni Makanya, who says, does the ANC Youth League have a policy that speaks about having political classes in provinces, regions, zones, and branches? It is important for a national structure of the ANC Youth League to give a direct mandate to the youth in branches to hold political classes. Yeah, I think those are the questions, Comrade Fasiha. On the last one, I would like to broaden it before I give it to you and say, in the same light that we spoke about the national dialogue and the kind of role that we should play, what role should the youth section of the ANC play at this current moment? Because I argue that in as much as it has been stressed that this is a moment of fundamental consequence for the nation, it's also equally a moment of fundamental consequence for the ANC as a political party, right? So in answering that last question, can you please just at least give us your thoughts on what role should we play internally within the ANC?
Okay, quite a few. So I noted everyone's names so that I can get it on the side as well. I agree with you. It's a fundamental moment also for the ANC. And we as young people also need to position ourselves. I mentioned a little bit of it earlier. There's an opportunity for us to gain a huge skill set, whether it's in coalition dispute resolution, whether it's in the ability to coalesce different political parties behind the agenda, we can say it here of the ANC or of, the National Democratic Revolution or our manifesto. There's fundamental moments in which we can do that, right? And I'll give you a good example. In Gauteng, we passed the Township Economic Development Act. And it was during my tenure as chairperson of the Economic Development Portfolio. And it was the first time in over 8 years that we passed a bill that was not a money bill, as in an actual piece of legislation. And that bill, Comrade Kifense, was passed unanimously across ANC, DA, IFP, ACDP, VF Plus. And no one disagreed, unanimous. And one of the ways we were able to do that is we took the time to sit down with each political party, get their views, find a common minimum program. They may not have agreed on everything, but we were able to come to an agreement in which all political parties agreed. And I always use this as an example because we as young people are not burdened with the same things as our elders are. Because we didn't necessarily have to fight in the struggle, we don't view everybody as harsh enemies. We may not agree with them. There may be our political differences, and there will always be ideological differences. But that doesn't mean that I can't be friends with a Luyolo Mpiti from the DA, for example, or from Naledi Chirwa from the EFF, where all of these people are my friends, right? And we're able to work with each other on a different level because we're able to put young people in the people first. And I think that there's a power to that as young people that we have. And those are the different skill sets that as young people in the ANC, we need to position ourselves for because it is a new era. And if we don't look at it as an opportunity for us to gain skills and opportunities, then we're also going to be left behind. But I think we need to talk a little bit about that more. So, Mhlonipeni, you asked around political classes. There is actually a political school, the Wartamba School of Leadership, and they're very accessible in terms of online sort of courses and all of that. But we as the Youth League, as part of the rebuilding, are trying to put back the politics into our branches and into our structures. And that's taking a lot of time, if I'm being honest, because you have very active branches when it comes to conferences and BGMs and congresses. But try and organize a political program, you'll have very little attendance. And that's one of the reasons why I think we need to start from the ground up. We are doing top down, but you need to do both so that you meet each other halfway in the middle. So I'd be very interested to hear where you're from. Maybe we can organize something. We can work with the local region, local zone, sub-region, and organize it because the infrastructure is there. As the Youth League, we have the programs. We go to the Oratambo school. We say, these are the topics we want to cover. Can you help us get some of the expertise? We can also get some of the expertise. And then we go, then we actually do it. We start the process. So it is there, but I don't think it's as active as it needs to be. And that's why maybe offline we can have a chat and see where you are, especially now as the dust settles, post this coalition or GNU, whatever you want to call it, post all of that. We need to get back to the ground and we need to get back to our communities. So it is fundamentally important. Tabani, I'm sorry, I'm just looking for your questions here. Right, on challenges facing youth and order of priorities. I mentioned it earlier. I think there are issues that do affect young people in particular, but I do think that we need to mainstream all of those issues. But number one on that list, I think we will all agree, is the issue of youth unemployment. And it's a monstrous, huge thing because everyone's like, just solve youth unemployment, as if we could just snap our fingers and do it. It is a cyclical, systemic problem. And it actually doesn't matter whether it's the ANC or the DA or the EFF or the VF Plus or MKP or anyone who comes into power, there will be youth unemployment in this country because of how the economy is structured and because of how I actually think apartheid designed us to be in this particular situation. So we need a number of different approaches to fix it. And that's why I always start with youth unemployment, because in the same way that we need to, let me say it like this. If you guys remember during COVID, we saw the very best of South Africa come together, the very best of the public sector, the private sector, civil society, us as communities. We showed up for each other. In the same way we did that, we now need to do this for youth unemployment. We need to say this is the kind of four or five drivers of the economy. And this is dealing with, I think, Vusi's question on economic development policies. One of the biggest drivers of our economy is still agriculture. So we can look at agro processing. And the reason why I'm saying agro processing is young people, it is a question of access to land. But even if you don't have access to land, there's ways in which we can process actual crops, actual agricultural goods into different products, and there's a larger markup on it, right? And there's an opportunity for us to get those skills that aren't necessarily in it. So that's one of the ways we need to do it. And that's actually linked fundamentally also to the cannabis economy. People laugh when I say it, but it's a huge opportunity for us as young people because it's a new industry. It means we don't have monopolies. We don't have to break a WMC, white monopoly capital kind of concept here. We need to be giving licenses to more young people, particularly Black entrepreneurs. That's one element. But we also need to look at stuff like hydroponics and aquaponics. So if you have a small space, you can still be doing agricultural processes. That's one of the drivers of the economy, right? We need to invest in skills and opportunities there. Manufacturing. Car manufacturing is a really big one. If you look at Tshwane, we have the Ford, the Tshwane SEZ. I think we're doing in developing Ford Rangers. So outside of the US, the largest amount of Ford Rangers are actually being assembled in South Africa. Now, notice I used the word assemble. What's the next step? We need to start creating those parts. Same thing with BMW in Rosslyn. Same thing with Toyota in Gqeberha and the Eastern Cape. There's huge opportunities for us there as young people. So that's another element in terms of drivers of key economic development policies. But also the third one on SMMEs. And we talk about it, but we're not actually doing enough. How difficult is it to start a business? How difficult is it to get funding for that business? In Gauteng, and my examples will always be this because of the last 5 years, the Gauteng Enterprise Propeller JEP had a turnaround time, listen to this, of 18 months. Now, I said to them, an SME, a small business, if you don't fund them today, forget 18 months, they'll be closed in a month. 2 months. So we need to also cut a lot of the red tape within government. And there's something called Operation Vulindlela, which is around opening up the space, cutting the red tape. And that's been a conference actually that's ongoing yesterday and today, in which we actually do this kind of physical, financial and also non-financial support for SMMEs, because that's a key driver of this economy that we haven't looked at. So these are just a few examples of where we need to focus our energies. And maybe, Comrade Kipinsa, we can come back to the same podcast and we could talk specific economic development policies, because I haven't even touched on the reindustrialization program and why we want to create more Black industrialists and what that actually means for the economy. But the long and the short of it is, looking at those 5 drivers, high growth sectors, ensuring that we're investing in skills in those sectors. Another one that I forgot to mention is the green economy. Everybody who's installing solar panels, most of them are coming from China. So we don't just want to be on the value chain as young people to install the solar panels. We want to be developing that. What are we doing as government to ensure that young people can actually develop the parts? Sure, we'll have a bit of an foreign policy issue with the Chinese, but we'll deal with that politically, right? The end of the day, we have to support our own, and we have to look at these different drivers of the economy and say, right, now that everyone's installing solar, now that everyone's doing boreholes, what does that mean for young people? How do we get young people in those high growth sectors? That's the one thing about access, but also around education and removing a lot of that red tape. And let me also, before I answer the next question, say this. The president, many people are very critical of him, but one thing he's been very good at is understanding business, but also understanding the public sector's role. And he said this some time ago, and there was a lot of controversy. He said, government's job is not to create jobs. But what people didn't quote was the next part of it. Our job is to create a conducive environment in order for job creation and opportunity that is economic to be created as well. And that is something that I think has already started to happen. The trouble with economic policy is it takes time to actually see it happen. So it takes years actually for you to see the fruit of some types of economic policy, especially macroeconomic policy. And that's also why I've mentioned quite a few of the micro issues, because those are day-to-day things that we relate to a little bit more. Tawani asked around the challenge. No, I think, did I cover that? Oh, Matlatsi on the ANC-led ANC Youth League led government taking over. I think that would be great, but I do think we need an intergenerational mix. Otherwise, we might go and create certain laws. I don't know if people know this, but we wanted at the most recent ANC conference to say that you can't take up a leadership role over the age of 65. And we said you could be a member, but we didn't want you necessarily to take up a leadership role. So senior ANC members were not too happy with us, but the point is that we really do need a good mix of skills, a good mix of experience. But I agree with you fundamentally that we need more young people, more innovative thinking, and we need to push. And a lot of us are holding our fingers because with this imminent cabinet announcement, we're hoping that a lot more young people will feature on it as well, and in key ministries. That's important.
Thank you very much, Fasiha. I'll just add one more, then you'll answer them with your closing remarks, because I know that your time is limited. So there's one more from Moscow who says again, how will this young parliamentarians, how are they going to be monitored? How is this GNU going to work, particularly on policies, right? And my question, and I guess we don't have time, we need to create time to have this separate conversation about the role of young people in foreign policy development and international relations. I mean, we have just seen today, after a protracted uprising in Kenya, that President William Ruto has eventually conceded, to the demands of young people. So I think it's important really to have that discussion about the impact of young people's activism in the context of foreign relations, particularly when we look at this whole concept of the rising global south, right? What is the role of young people in that regard? What is the role of young people in ensuring that BRICS, for instance, delivers on what it has committed itself to, right? Even in terms of the peoples to peoples exchange, what cultural exchanges are we having that are driven by young people, not by coincidence, but deliberately as a strategy to say, we want to move from this particular paradigm to this one, and this is how we're going to do it. Sorry, Fasiha, you're muted.
I was muted. I said, I think we're going to need a whole podcast for this one, but let me try a little bit high level. So let's be very clear, right? The GNU process has had certain points that are non-negotiables, right, for us as the ANC. One of those non-negotiables has, of course, been the transformation project. Many people were concerned about BEE and a lot of the inroads that have been made in terms of transforming the economy and other spaces. It's not where we want it to be, albeit I agree, but it's a lot better than it's ever been before, right? So that was one of the red line points. The other red line point was also around our foreign policy, because we said this is also non-negotiable towards our developmental agenda. And remember, key to our foreign policy as the ANC has been to create a multipolar world. And what does that mean? It means we don't want one particular country to be the center of all power. We don't want only the US to be a superpower. We want power to be spread evenly. It shouldn't matter that a poorer country at a COP discussion has less of a say just by virtue of them being poor, and the US can go in and, for example, veto everything in the UN, right? We saw this even on the issue of Palestine when the whole world was saying ceasefire, like this is again a minimum program, ceasefire now. And then they veto and they have the ability to do that. So we fundamentally believe in a multipolar world. That does mean that we need to create different centers. BRICS is one of those things. BRICS is an alignment of countries that sort of do have a common agenda and common understanding. It doesn't mean we agree on everything, but it does mean that we agree on some of the things I mentioned. And there's opportunity also for us as young people. We don't want to live in a world in which we are always the bad guys or always the victims or always, I mean, aren't we all tired of those tropes of the African continent always being in a shitty situation in comparison to other countries? And that's what we want to change. We want to change it in terms of trade, in terms of the economy, economy. We want to change it in terms of diplomatic power. That's very important. And that's also why, in many ways, the ICJ case for Palestine is not actually about Palestine in many ways. It is about us staring down the Western Bloc and saying, we're not afraid of you. You've done something wrong, and we will say something about it. And it's about reasserting ourselves on the global platform. And that's why BRICS is such a big threat to NATO, to all these different spaces. It's not just about Russia. It's about the fact that the masses, this is important, the masses of the world, not just the country, the global south, Latin America, Africa, Asia, all these different places are saying, actually, no, you're not going to tell us what to do. You're not going to decide the terms of reference anymore. And that's why it's become so important for us as young people to have a say. And also why we also need to influence that foreign policy. How many young diplomats do we really have, Kifense? I think the number is very low. I don't have it offhand, but I'd wager it's far too low. What are we doing in terms of, I mean, they mentioned the cadet program. That's a new thing. I think it's been actually being brought back into DIRCO. But we want more young people to enter the space, because in the same way we're fighting against youth unemployment here, what are we doing to create opportunities for us to study overseas and come back, or to gain those critical skills? I mean, there's a very good example on AI, right? Why are we not sending a couple of people to go work 2 or 3 years in China, come back with those skills and knowledge, reinvested in our economy? So foreign policy are parts of those things. And that's also one of the reasons why we said those are some of our red line points, because we're not going to go backwards as South Africa. And this is very important. In any iteration of a GNU, it can never be at the harm of the developmental state and what we are trying to achieve. We've achieved a great deal in 30 years. We all know it's not enough. And that is actually fundamentally why it becomes even more important in this moment to be bold, to actually say this is what it is, but also to ensure that we push it going forward. I know that doesn't entirely answer what you said, Comrade Kafensa, but and I'm happy to take another two questions from the audience. But I think we need a lot more time to sort of delve into that, because I think it's actually not a well understood enough issue in terms of our international relations and what it means for us as young people, and more importantly, where the opportunities are. So if you're okay, we can take two or three questions from the
No, thank you
audience.
so much, Comrade Fasiha. I don't see any other questions here, but rather comments which I've been sharing. But as you have said, that the conversation can be had further with you on your different platforms. I've just, shared your different handles for Facebook, X, as well as TikTok. Um, I think on that last point of foreign policy, in fact, I think it should be non-negotiable going into this national dialogue, and we must have a serious perspective on it as the youth, as to what type of foreign policy do we think is going to be important moving forward, because we must not underestimate the fact that in this whole quest of a paradigm shift from a unipolar world to a multipolar one, no flashbacks. They are flashbacks. I was having a conversation with someone who was saying it may very well be that part of what's happening in Kenya, it's that sort of conflict, that is taking place in this whole back and forth in this quest to move from a multipolar world, from a unipolar world to a multipolar one.
Let
So
me
I think
also
it's
say,
it's very important.
sorry, I actually forgot about Kenya and you did mention it. For those who don't know, you can Google it. It's fascinating. Young people have been on the streets protesting. And the reason why, I just want to add on to your point, I agree with that actually. It's just so important to remind ourselves what we as young people can do. We've been sort of led down a road of disillusion, of you're never going to get a job, you're never going to get an opportunity. Why bother even participating in the political process? Here you have young people who have made international news and have said, we disagree with a particular piece of legislation. This is what they're actually fighting about, right? And they've said, we disagree, we're not going to allow it to pass. And actually, as Kivitz has said now, the Kenyan government has actually said, okay, fine. And that was because the young people in their majority went out onto the streets and said something. Now, I'm not necessarily saying we have to go out onto the streets. I'm saying that we must never underestimate our power as young people to influence the political process, or, frankly speaking, what our lives can look like and what they should look like. Sorry to interrupt you. That's the part on Kenya I forgot to say.
No, singayisusa nanini na, singayisusa nje. So if we must go to the streets, we'll go to the streets. But thank you so much, Comrade Fasia, for joining us today. I think we've touched on a number of important points. I think this is one episode that one will have to revisit over and over because there are so many key issues that we touched on. So thank you so much. The one key takeaway for me is the kind of reskilling that we need to engage in, the kind of self development that we need to, self and collective development that we need to engage in this new era of coalitions, that whole issue of how do we negotiate with other parties? How do we coalesce? How do we form social compacts, even amongst ourselves? To understand that temporarily we agree to push this matter to its very end. And that's very important. So thank you very much for touching on that. We really appreciate your time. We wish you and all the young people that are going into parliament, particularly those under the banner of the African National Congress, to do well, represent us well, be bold. Some of us will be watching closely and will hold you accountable.
As you
I
should.
have the privilege of having your number. So when I tell you that I complete fast, I small
This
much,
doesn't
you
make
know.
sense.
Yeah, so we'll be ready to hold you accountable, but more importantly, we'll be ready to support you, even through, going on the streets, because sometimes while you guys are inside advocating for something, we must be on the outside to apply the pressure. We used to do that so well during SRC days where you'd be in Senate and would just be outside, ensuring that there are people that are helping us to apply pressure because we know if the matter goes to a vote, there's no way we're going to win. So the best thing we can do is ensure that, we are struggling on both sides. So we'll be supporting you. We wish you well. And once again, thank you so much, Comrade Fasia, for joining us today.
No, thanks. And I think we need to come back to this platform. Many questions, I think, also unresolved on there. And I think we need to really give some thought, especially heading into that national dialogue. But just to see the level of comments and questions are really incredible. And it really does prove the point we've been making all along, all of us, that as young people, we're ready to lead. We have ideas, we have thinking in terms of what we want to do for our country. So also kudos to the audience and those who've been listening in. And I'm looking forward to the next podcast. Thank you for having me.
No, thank you so much. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us today. We truly appreciate it. Your comments, your interaction have been great. I have no doubt that I speak on behalf of everyone when I say this was quite a refreshing episode, but this is what Tintswalo's perspective is all about. All our episodes, if you go through them, they are heavily loaded with substance, which proves the point that young people are not sitting idle and watching events pass them by, but they are actively involved in influencing discourse, in influencing transformation, and the thoughts that they have are actually important and loaded with substance, and we need to bring them to the fore as much as we possibly can. Please do join us next week when we have our 10th episode. There is a possibility that the 10th episode may be a recorded conversation. We're still discussing the possibility of that. Just to mark, this 10th episode milestone, we might actually have a face-to-face contact recording. But also, we've been promising that public dialogues are coming back. I can confirm that now everything is set. We're just waiting for our speakers to confirm so that we can release the poster, because many have been complaining that unfortunately they feel like this space is not sufficient because it does not allow them to come on to actually give their inputs, outside of texting them on the comment section. So with public dialogues, we allow people to actually come on and engage the speakers, but also even the presentations of the speakers are prepared well ahead of time. So they come there with presentations, and from there we engage those presentations. So that it will be coming back soon. I can't confirm if it will be this Sunday because we're just waiting for the speakers we have earmarked to confirm. If they do, definitely this Sunday we'll be having a session. So stay tuned on our social media platforms for more information about that. But thank you so much for joining us, and have yourselves a good night until we see you again next week, same time, same place.